Good evening and welcome to our photography program, Composing Your Images with Leading Lines with Frank Stopa. I'm Lorraine Maffa, Programming Coordinator for Loudoun County Public Library and your host this evening. Please feel to communicate with me during the program by using the chat feature located on the bottom right of the WebEx screen. I can relay your comments and questions to Frank during the Q&A at the end of the program. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Frank Stopa is a Washington, D.C. area fine art minimalist photographer, specializing in black and white landscapes and seascapes. An avid technical scuba diver, he also combines diving and photography to capture images with maritime history and underwater themes. Frank's photographs often explore and bring to light our forgotten history. Welcome back, Frank. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Lorraine. Welcome, everybody. Glad to be here. All right, so let me get started right away. The name of the title of the presentation, as you probably already know, is Composing Your Images with Leading Lines. And that's what I'm going to talk about here for about the next hour, maybe hour and 15, if Lorraine lets me go a little longer. And we're going to talk about all the images you see here are mine. We're going to talk about how I use leading lines to tell a story. That's really sort of the essence of today's workshop. And Lorraine already introduced me. I'm a DC area minimalist fine art photographer. Photographic composition with leading lines to tell your story is the essence of what I'm going to talk about today. It is literally creating more of a story feel in your image than just a straight, flat image of your subject. So let's get right into it. First thing I'm going to talk about is what is composition, because we're talking about composition with leading lines. We're going to use a quote from noted French painter Henri Matisse. He states that composition is the art of arranging in a decorative manner the diverse elements at the painter's command to express his feelings. The idea is this. It is to arrange your image. Don't just take pictures of something you see. Look at it. Look at your subject. Think about it. Compose an image. Frame the image in a way that tells a little bit of a story. Composition with leading lines is all about, as I said, telling a story with your image. Your viewer hopefully imagines all that is in, through, and behind your image. My hope when I shoot an image is to leave people thinking about what is going on in the image, what is behind the scene, what is beyond the scene, to get people imagining or thinking about a possible story. Your job as the photographer then, as the composer of the image, is to draw the viewer through your image, through your story. And we do that by creating focal points for the viewer. A focal point is going to be something that might be a subject, it might be a person, it might be an object, it might be a stand of trees, it might be a bank of clouds that initially attracts your attention and then focuses that attention then beyond to the subject of your photo. Okay. Are there rules to composing with composing photographs and composing with leading lines? The answer is yes. There are too many of them. And I'm not going to talk about all of them. If you want to search online, you're going to find that there are rules for composition, whether it's artistic composition, photographic composition, composition in the visual arts. There are principles of composition. There are concepts that apply. There are guidelines, and there are even elements of design that you can apply to creating an image. My recommendation is go out and search online, learn them, and use them. Eventually, as you get experience with capturing and images and composing your images, your experience will help you bend the rules to create the images that you want and tell the stories that you want. So that's enough really about the rules. I'm not going to get into that to any great extent. That said, I am going to talk about a couple. There are rules. We're going to show you this list first. Ideas and concepts that are used in the composition of images, contrast between light and dark, obviously isolation or minimalism, placement of the object within the frame. We'll talk about the rule of thirds in a second. Convergence of lines and patterns, negative space to offset the image or balance the image with little to nothing to balance it out. Lines, obviously, leading lines we're going to talk about. and lots of other things that you can explore as you search and learn about composing images. There are three real rules that I like very much and decided I wanted to present here a little bit with a couple of examples to get us going with the idea of composing images with leading lines. And so my favorites are negative space. As Lorraine said in the introduction, I'm a minimalist. I prefer to have less in my images. I prefer to have one focal point on one subject. It's not always like that. It doesn't always work. It never works that way if you're a landscape photographer. There's just too much stuff out there in the world. But to focus on something and minimize outside distractions is my tendency. Negative space gives you a way to create less in your image with focus on your subject. Okay. It provides balance as well and contrast to your subject. When I say balance, there's balance between the subject that's in one side of your image and empty space that offsets it and in some ways frames it. It focuses for sure the viewer on your subject without any doubt whatsoever. So I like negative space. We're going to see examples of that. I'll talk about it as we go through the examples in a little bit. Here are some examples. First one is my image called Pier and Moon. This is where I use negative space. The negative space, which is the air around this pier, which is at Leesylvania State Park, down on the Potomac River. The negative space draws your attention to the pier, which is really the only interesting object in the image. And if you start at the very lower left corner and follow the pier, it kind of rises to the end of the pier on a slight diagonal. And then if you keep looking from there, it also gives you the chance to look up and see the moon in the opposite corner. That's one of my favorite negative space examples. But it's also a leading line if you think about it. The pier is the leading line that draws your eye from the left and forces you to start looking right towards the middle of the image. And then when you're there, you also catch the moon up top. Now, I will say one more thing about that, and that is you might also start looking at the image the other way around. A lot of people will look at the image and see the moon, and from there go look down and say, okay, what's this all the way to the left, and see the pier. And I've got another photo later on that'll do the same thing for you. Another example of negative space is my image called Ascent from Bedfordshire. This is the HMT Bedfordshire is a wreck of a World War II British trawler that did anti-submarine warfare work on the North Carolina coast in World War II. It was sunk with all hands lost, and it is now a dive site and a war grave. This image I captured rising up from the wreck back to our boat of these two divers. The negative space, obviously, is the blue of the ocean, which provides little to no input for you, little to no stimulus in terms of looking at an object, which then focuses your eye on the two divers rising up to the boat. It also is an example of a leading line because there is literally a line in underwater. It's the anchor line that rises up to our boat that we were diving from and leads you right to the divers. So that's another good example of negative space. Okay, my next rule is the rule of thirds. Rule of thirds, this is a little bit of fun also. Basically, and I'm creating this definition myself here. I'm sure there are plenty of other people who give you other definitions. But basically, the rule of thirds is creating an off-center composition because off-center compositions tend to be more pleasing to the human eye. They prompt us to look through an image to the subject rather than seeing a subject dead smack in the middle of the image. When that happens, you tend to look at the subject right in the middle and you don't see anything that's around them. It prompts us more to think about a story within or behind the image because you're starting from a start point and then going through that start point to the subject. Rule of thirds is a lot of fun. Now, there are plenty of people who tell you, the rule of thirds, you can break that all you want. Well, learn it first because you realize that it does help you create more interesting images. This little graph shows you how to think about the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds essentially says, divide your image vertically into 3 equal segments, horizontally into 3 equal segments. And you can see where I've got those red circles. Those circles indicate the intersections of the vertical and the horizontal thirds. When you place your image on one of those thirds, say the vertical third, which is the upright on the right side, you're putting your image within or on the third. Then you're going to have hopefully interesting information on the left side that leads you to the right side. The same is possible if you want to go from the right side to the left side, or from the bottom up or the top down. So you can put your image, your subject, on one of those lines, or you can put it even more specifically in the range of the intersection of those lines and create an image that that adheres to the quote unquote rule of thirds. I'll show you a couple examples of where those apply. And this image is my image called Over the Falls. I shot this at Great Falls National Park a few years back. And this, generally speaking, applies to the rule of thirds. And the reason that is because the most important subject here is the kayaker dropping down the falls. If you look at this image this way with a grid of thirds over it, you see that the kayaker is in the lower third, almost in the right third, almost to that intersection. Not quite, but close enough. What happens here is your eye will tend to look at the water. And where do you look for the water? You look at the top left corner. The water is flowing towards you, and then it drops right down the middle of the image towards the right side third and the bottom third, where you see the kayaker. So there is a bit of a leading line here, and there is the rule of thirds. The leading line is literally not a line per se, but it is the flow of the water which draws your eye to the kayaker. What's interesting here, and it's a concept I'm going to talk about a couple of times and try to reinforce in this presentation, is that a leading line doesn't have to be a line exactly or specifically. It can be implied. In this case, the leading line is implied by the water, or the flow of the water in a direction, which becomes your leading line, which flows across the top of the image, down the middle, and then over to the kayaker. That's the idea of leading line and the rule of thirds applied all at the same time. This image is a little bit different. This one is not quite as obvious, but I'm putting it here because, and I'll brag a little bit, I won a photo contest with this. I won an award at a photo contest with this image a couple years back, and like it a lot. It also has to do with my diving, and that's a friend of mine from Toronto who is in the water in Peacock Springs in Florida. This applies, as you'll see in 2 seconds, to the rule of thirds, basically like that. You can see my diver friend is in the lower left intersection of the thirds in the image. Everything else above and to the right of my buddy tends to be more or less negative space. But there is also a sense that there is a leading line here too, if you look at it. If you start in the lower right, down all the way in the lower right third, all the way at the right edge of the photo, you can follow the line of the ground or the edge of the water that flows up to the left, across the middle of the image, and then flows on the left side. It flows down back towards what looks like a set of stairs. When you get to that set of stairs, you are being drawn to the diver. That image also applies to the rule of thirds, has a leading line in that sense, a line that is somewhat of a spiral. If you've ever heard of the golden ratio, that tends to be sort of the way the golden ratio works, which draws you into the center of the image, almost in a spiral-like manner. But anyway, there's another good example of the rule of thirds. The next thing that I'm going to talk about, or the next rule, which is the last rule that I'm going to talk about, is the use of diagonals. I love diagonals. I did a presentation on using angles in photographic composition a couple years, I think a year and a half ago maybe, and talked about things called Dutch angles, that kind of thing. In any event, diagonals are used to create your lines, to create a sense of depth in your image. In two-dimensional photography, diagonal lines can be used to create that depth, to draw your eye through the image. They can draw you side to side. They can draw you around in that spiral like the previous image. They can draw you down across through that waterfall that I just showed you a little bit. They can go from the front of the image deeper into the back, so from the foreground to the background, to literally draw you in, or they can take you from the bottom up and create that sense. So diagonals are fantastic as well. Here are a couple examples as well. This is one that I call Encounter in the Blue. Was a moon jelly that I shot on an anchor line off of the Florida Keys a couple years ago. And there are two kinds of diagonals here. The one is the line, that line that goes up eventually to the boat we're headed to. But that line starts low down and draws your eye up to the moon jelly. It makes a nice little curve right before the moon jelly. So it kind of curves right around and draws your attention straight to the moon jelly. There's one other set of diagonals that really emanate from the lower right corner, which look like sun rays that are shining up at the moon jelly. So your attention is drawn diagonally from the lower left and the lower right up to the moon jelly. And those basically act as leading lines, those diagonals. So I really like that image for that purpose. It's also very minimalist, lots of negative space, which tends to appeal to me quite a lot. There's one thing that I did want to note here as well. I am in this case looking across and up in the water column, heading up towards the surface, and it looks like the sun is shining from below me, and that's something that is kind of strange to get used to, which is why the diagonals are created the way they are. When the sun shines down on the surface of the water, the water tends to bend light around an object. And that bending of the light creates, if you look straight down into the water, it creates light rays that shine down underneath you. And it looks like they're actually shining up, but it's literally the bending of the light. And it's the water that bends that light. So it's kind of strange, but an interesting phenomenon. And it created a nice little set of diagonals for me in this case. So a lot of fun. Okay, next image. This one is called Walking the Arcade. This is an image of a gentleman walking in the arcade at Union Station, at the front of Union Station. And the use of diagonals here to lead the eye are literally created not by any lines per se, but by the architecture itself, by the structure of the arcade. As you can see, you're literally funneled all the way down that corridor to the end of the arcade, to the building at the other end. And with the gentleman in the shadow there as a silhouette, you basically are left, I'm left when I took this photo, wondering where's that guy headed. I mean, he is obviously headed down that direction. Is he headed all the way to the end? What's at the other end? What's waiting for him? So that diagonal draws you in and draws you to the end of the image. Okay. Next one is my last example here, which is entitled Monochrome Light. This is a very heavily post-produced photo that I shot of the architecture of one of the art museums. I think it's the main art museum in Savannah, Georgia. But I got such a nice shining of light through the windows and onto the ground and onto the structure that I had to create this image, and really loved it. This obviously is nothing but diagonals. The interesting thing about this in terms of diagonals is that first diagonal in the lower left corner, it really draws you or pulls you in to the right middle of the image, the right third, if you will. The lower right corner diagonal is slightly diagonal, draws you up to the same place. And then from the top, all of those diagonal lines of literally the windows that shine the light in, draw you down to that piece that is in the right middle part of the image, or the right third of the image. It's completely abstract, but it's intended literally to suck you in and draw you to that part and just imagine what's there and think about what's there. So that's diagonals. So those are the three concepts that I really like, the rules that are my favorites when it comes to composing an image, and especially when composing an image and thinking about leading lines: negative space, rule of thirds, and diagonals. Okay. Now we're going to talk about leading lines. Okay. And then I'm going to show examples and talk about examples of how leading lines can be found, created, and used to tell a story. Leading lines are literally pathways that lead your viewer through your image or through your story. For me, the really interesting thing about photography is, regardless of how minimalist it is, how little there is in an image, there still has to be, in my mind, something that says, what's going on here? What is this? What am I looking at? What's happening here? Leading lines help draw you to that and ask that question of you. What do you see? What do you imagine? Generally speaking, leading lines do lead toward the subject of your image or focus of your image, so they can focus on your subject, or they can literally lead you to your subject, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. They can be roads, they can be clouds, they can be structures, as we talked about with the arcade photo. The structure created that leading line or that diagonal. Clouds can do it, roads can do it. Leading lines can be, as I said earlier, leading lines can be implied, i.e., you can use contrast in your image, you can use shading in your image, highlighting in your image, and various other post-production techniques to create, or vignetting, to create the sense that you're getting drawn into the image to look at the subject. So we'll talk about here. Okay. Leading lines can be curved lines. As you saw in the very first image in the presentation, you had curved light lines, and I've got another one to show you right away that gives you that example. They can be diagonal lines, which are straight right to your subject. They can be straight lines. They can be S-curves. They can be jagged, if you want to call them jagged S-curves with sharp corners. And I've got an example of that in a little while. They can literally be the difference between light and dark, or contrast, shading, highlighting in an image. You can use light as a leading line. I have one photo that I shot 2 weeks ago in the mountains of West Virginia, where a flare from the sun created a leading line for me. Unfortunately, I don't have it loaded in this presentation, but the point is you can use light as a leading line as well, and I believe I do have another example of that as well in this presentation. Roads make great leading lines. Clouds can work as well. Structures of all sorts can be leading lines. Water lines can also be leading lines. Anything you can imagine that has some kind of shape to it can be used to draw you in, and that's the idea. Okay, images with leading lines. At this point, I am about 25 minutes into the presentation. Lorraine likes to keep me about an hour, and I usually talk a little more. Sorry, Lorraine. So at this point, I'm going to go through a series of images and talk about them, and then give you some ideas and some motivation to practice on your own, and then answer any questions that you may have. So this is the very first image I'm going to talk about. This one is entitled Convergence, and as you can see, it's an image shot. It was shot through the windshield of my car. My wife was driving when I shot this image. Oops, excuse me. And it was shot in a tunnel. I believe it was the Inner Harbor Tunnel at Baltimore. The really cool thing here is the lights above on each side of the tunnel and the double line down the middle of the road, all curved right around that bend in the tunnel. And those are the leading lines. They're basically curves that lead you right to that central point in the image, where there happens to be a car about to disappear into the unknown of the tunnel. That's why I call it convergence. Everything converges right there in that point. The leading lines all curve and draw you in. This one's a little bit different. Oh, this is an example of using light as a leading line. This is a cave diving image from Florida. That same friend I showed you earlier, this is him as we were dropping down into a cave. If you look just below him, there's sort of a hook-shaped rock. He's going to drop in behind there, and in about two seconds after that, he's going to be underground, underwater. But I got this image. I wanted to give a sense for where you come from when you're cave diving and where you're headed to. You're coming from the light and you're headed into total darkness. And in this particular case, there was enough particulate in the water so that when the sun came through, it created beautiful light rays. Those light rays are your leading line. The leading line starts at the top of the image and draws you straight down to my diver buddy, and straight down. If you follow those lines, they almost disappear right into that hole. That's where he's headed. So that's what I think is sort of an unusual or atypical use of leading lines. This is one of my favorite leading line images. It's called All Downhill. This was shot looking down the face of a cliffside that was overlooking the Montmorency waterfall in Quebec, outside of Quebec City in Canada. And basically the image is leading you all the way to the bottom. You start at the top. The top of the image is on the lower side of the image here, or the bottom of the image, with these two people walking down the stairs. And if you just follow those stairs, you're going to see where those people end up. And if you follow those stairs down all the way up to the top third, top right side third, and then take that sharp left bend and start heading farther downhill. If you head all the way down there, you'll see a group of people at the bottom of the stairs, and then you'll also see the path that leads you literally to the water's edge, which is up towards the top of the image. So that's a classic example of a leading line. It's not a line, it's a structure. And you know where that image is going. So when I look at that image, I look at that couple walking down the stairs, and I think, where are they headed? What are they going to do? Are they going to go all the way down, all the way to the bottom? Are they going to make it? What's down there? This one I shot at the Virginia Museum of Fine Art in Richmond about 4 days ago, right before the snow. And if any of you have ever been to this museum, they have great exhibits. They were doing an Ansel Adams exhibit that ended the other day, and I was there for that. And walking around the building, shot this one with my iPhone, shot several images of the building. This one in particular caught my attention because I knew I was teaching this class, and I knew, hey, leading lines. What's a leading line? This image I've entitled Leading Lines, literally, because that's what it is. The banisters on the stairs are leading lines that draw you up to the top of the image. You literally look at those stairs and you say to yourself, this is inviting me to come up to the top. And the banister lines are drawing you up towards a vanishing point on the landing, and then they turn to the right and go up and take you up into the unknown. That's the idea of using a leading line. Cool place to go. This was also in the Museum of Fine Arts as well. And this is a staircase that I really liked and tried to play with. There's a lot of distractions around it, so I created this vignette. So there are two things that are going on with this staircase. The first one is, I've talked about S-curves. Well, this is kind of an S-curve because it goes up from the left to the right, goes back up from the right to the left, goes back and crosses from the left to the right. So it goes up and across in an S shape, sort of an S-shaped pattern or a Z-shaped pattern. And so a classic leading line. Clearly you're going into the stairs at the bottom and heading all the way to the top, so you can follow that line up. The other thing that I've done here to remove distractions through shading and all that, which is not quite a leading line, but it is to create a vignette. As you look at it, you can see that I've created a white vignette that kind of fades everything out as you move outward. Vignettes are almost like leading lines. They're almost like cones that funnel you down into your image. So I've done that as well to create this image. This is another one, just had a little bit of fun at the museum, shot the picture, played with it that night when I got home and said, I think I can use this for the class. This one is an image that I call Shadowy Road. This was shot on a back road in Charles County, Maryland, not too far from the Mallows Bay ship graveyard in Maryland on the Potomac River. The reason this is a nice leading line is because it literally is a leading line drawing you from where you are in your vehicle over that little crest and then up the hill and into the trees, and you're going to disappear into the countryside. Literally, the line is leading you in there, telling you what's going on. Wonder what's going on in this image and where am I going? Okay, next. This image is called Up to the Clouds, and this is a classic example of a structure being used for leading a leading line, and this is an abandoned pier in St. George, Bermuda. The interesting thing about this was when I took this image, there happened to be this nice little, tiny little baby thundercloud hanging right over the top, right above the pier as I looked down and took the shot. The leading line is literally that pathway along that pier to the end, which draws your eye deeper and deeper from the front of the image to the back of the image or to the middle ground of the image, and then looking beyond it to the water line and the clouds in the sky above it. So I think this is a classic use of a leading line. Another one of my favorites. This image is entitled Snowy Street. And no, this wasn't shot the other day during our 2 days ago during our snowstorm. This was shot two years ago, I think, or 3 years ago, the last time we had snow. And this is an example of using leading lines to draw you through the image. The leading lines in this case are not necessarily lines, but they're the tracks of cars that have driven over the snow in the early stages of this snowfall. They draw you from the lower left in a nice curve around through the two lights, and then the street bends back to the right and heads off towards the center of the image, towards that third light in the background. Another example of using occurrences, if you will, just the way nature, or not nature, but the way the world provides you visual input. Didn't have to create that. If there was no snow, the street itself could have been used as that leading line. Okay. This image I've entitled Photographer at Work. There's a friend of mine from Newfoundland, Canada. His name's Rick Stanley, who runs a dive and tourism operation up there. And this is him shooting photos of a little sea pinnacle off of Bell Island, Newfoundland. Shot this from above him and up on the cliff looking out towards him. And there are two concepts here, or two different perspectives on leading lines. In this particular case, the leading line is that line of the edge of the cliff. If you start out, some people look and see the photographer first at that top right third, where Rick is standing and shooting the pinnacle down below. And if you follow the edge of the cliff around down to the left and to the lower left third, it draws you right to the pinnacle that he's shooting with his camera right there. If you look at the image the other way around and see the pinnacle first, you see the pinnacle, and then the edge of the cliff draws you up and to the right. And look, what do you find out? You find out that there's a photographer named Rick who's on that corner who's shooting that pinnacle from above. So in this case, that leading line is an edge. It is a cliff, the edge of the cliff, actually, and it leads you to look at that image in two different ways, and to imagine two different things, or to see it in two different ways.
Quick question. Someone's asking, do the lines of that pinnacle, the swirl of the lines and the swirl of the water, and does that also sort of take you down into the water? Do you?
That's a very interesting observation, and I never thought of it that way. But if you look at that, if you follow from the photographer and follow the cliff edge down, and eventually arrive at that pinnacle, if you keep following around and swirl around in a vortex, if you will, that water that is bubbled up around the left side of the pinnacle does swirl around it and draws you even closer into the pinnacle. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's how someone was
Bottom
seeing it.
line
It's
is any of this
interesting.
that draws your eye into that image, whether the pinnacle is what you think is the subject or the photographer. For me,
Yeah.
I I think I was imagining the pinnacle as the subject of this photo, and probably was going to shoot that without Rick in there. But he was so intent on standing there and shooting his shots that I took a picture of him too, at the same time, and that's the image that came out. So you could look at it from two perspectives. But yeah, nice observation. I never really thought that much about the foamy water around the pinnacle as part of that line. But it is the line. The line doesn't, as I said before, it doesn't have to be an explicit line of any sort. It can be a structure. In this case, it's a geologic structure, which is the cliff edge. And now, since the commenter stated it, the bubbles around the pinnacle also become part of your leading line. Good observation. Good question. Thank you. Okay, where are we next? This is another one I shot at the museum the other day, and I call this one Center of Attention. And this is a little bit of an unusual take on leading lines. And I liked it very much and had to include it in this class because it's just so different. I was in this atrium area in the museum and was looking around at things. I walked up that stairway where I showed you before, the leading lines, where I walked up the stairway and ended up overlooking this piano. And the piano happened to be nicely lit with some of these overhead lights, and it was perfect photo. There are two things that really drew my attention here. Well, one thing that drew my attention, and the other one that I created in post-processing. The first is when I saw this image, the first thing that I thought was, well, don't turn the camera down and shoot the piano. Turn the camera out and put the camera down in the lower third of the image. Make it the subject, because everything else is going to draw you in. If you look at the top of the image, there are two diagonal lines created by the support beams in the ceiling that come diagonally in towards the top third. If you do the vertical third or the horizontal third. And then you have four straight posts that come straight down and lead you from the ceiling diagonally to the middle and then down to the floor where the piano is, which was also nicely lit. So light also drew you in there as well. In post-processing, I accentuated that by creating a bit of a vignette around the edge of the image so that there was literally light on each side, left and right, that came sort of down and across the image to the piano. So you're being led a little bit by light, but mostly by those support structures and all of that together. So a little bit unusual. Most people think of S-curves and diagonals, and you have to do that. Well, this is one that is a little bit different. So liked that one. Basically, if you use your imagination, you're going to come up with all kinds of interesting ways to create lines, leading lines that draw you into the story. Okay, next image. This one I shot in St. Louis. This is the Gateway Arch. And very simple little photo called Arch in Blue. I have a friend that lives in St. Louis, an artist, and her name is Julie Campbell. I'll mention her that way. She's responsible for this photo because she knew this was back in October. I drove out to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and was shooting photographs for an organization from the 1921 Tulsa massacre. And I stopped in St. Louis on the way. This was my one stop, and I set it up so that I had enough time to stop here for a couple of hours to shoot the Gateway Arch, which was a possible target for me, and got there. And Julie had told me no matter what, I asked her, I said, was there anything that I need to keep in mind as I'm shooting the arch, any preferred angles or anything like that? I didn't want to just shoot this straight on. Here's the arch. Wow, nice curve. Looks like half of a McDonald's insignia. She said, go to the bottom and shoot up. Go for strange angles, which I've obviously taught. Never thought about it with this arch, but she pointed me to that and said, go to the bottom of the arch and see what you find. And she helped me discover leading lines that created this image. For me, the focal point of this image is really the glint of sunlight that's shining off the underside of the arch, sort of basically in the middle of the image, a little bit above the middle of the image. The leading lines are the arch itself, which leads you from the lower left up and around, and from the lower right up to that spot where the sun is shining. And I purposely silhouetted the sun so that it's sort of, what do I want to say, emanating from behind that arch, but not too much. You have a sense that it's there, shining on that spot. So that's my idea with leading lines with that arch in blue. My next one, this was a lot of fun. This was shot in Frank's basement. Oops, got a couple spots on there. This image is entitled Painted Light Number 8, and it is subtitled Spectre. And this was Frank on a bored afternoon, bad weather, nothing to do in the middle of the pandemic. I was playing with my camera, trying to come up with an interesting photograph, and silly me, I put a black background up on actually the desk I'm working from right here. I put a jar, actually a big long flower vase, big long, about 6 inches high and about an inch across in diameter, big long cylinder of a glass, laid it down, and literally shined a flashlight in it and started turning the flashlight around inside that glass to see what would happen. In the end, the glass, the light shone through the glass onto the background, and I shot the photo. The interesting thing is it created this entire swirling, if you want to call it a vortex of light that swirled all the way around, and at the bottom created this kind of apparition, if you will. I call it specter, in the center of the image. Doesn't exactly apply to the rule of thirds. Sorry, it's in the middle of the image, but every once in a while you break those images or those rules. But it created a nice swirl of a leading line, or a giant curve, if you will, that swirled all the way around right to that specter, leading you to wonder what's there. So another example of a leading line. Okay, this is an image that I shot probably, well, at this point, 8 years ago. I call it Gothic Passage, and it is inside the National Cathedral in DC. And this is another example of leading lines. There are multiple things going on here. There's the pattern of light that's shining through the windows on the floor, which almost is like a stair-step pattern all the way down. And it is within a hallway that is headed towards the center of the image, that is converging on essentially what becomes a vanishing point at the arch at the end of the corridor. So it is literally the patterns of the building, the light on the floor, that draw you in and draw you all the way to the other end of the corridor and wonder, oh, who's down there at that other end? It's called Gothic Passage. Okay, a few more. This one is very different in terms of leading lines, but they absolutely apply. This is an image I call Reflection, and it is there is post-processing in this, although not as much as you would think. There is some blurring. There are multiple images superimposed here, but there is some blurring of the trees in the background. If you look closely from the water line up, I've done a motion blur on the image. That motion blur, those lines literally are lines pointing downward to the trees that are reflected in the water. So the leading lines of the trees are literally pointing you down to the water. If you look at the water, what really captivates me in this image is the reflection in the water. So those lines drive you down into the water to look at the water. And the water is nice and bright white because that's where the light is shining. And it draws you to that light, which takes you from the lower right portion of the image and drives you up in a gentle curve up to the tree and the shadowy figure standing on the edge of the water. So for me, the leading lines here are the blur that I've used to drive you downward into the water, but also the light that is reflected off the water in a gentle curve that ends up right by the figure, the man and his reflection in the water. So that's called reflection. Another example of leading lines. This is one where it's really, you're really using shading and highlighting, shadows and light and contrast to create that driving line. This is one I shot 3 days before Christmas. I was diving with some friends and took a shot of one of my friends, and turns out there's some interesting leading lines here as well. As you look at this diver, he appears to be swimming from the left side of the image diagonally towards us, and across us to the right side of the image. And he's swimming underneath something and into something, into a little bit of darkness. And as you see, from the lower left portion of the image, just below his tank at the bottom of the image, there's a diagonal line that comes up diagonally across all the way to the middle right side of the image. There's also another line that comes from the upper left third and shoots diagonally across to the right and slightly downward towards the same area, which is the area of the darkness where the diver is entering. The direction of the diver is also somewhat a leading line because of the angle that he's at and where he's headed. There's also a line created literally by the light that's on his hand that is aiming him or pointing him in the direction of where he's swimming so that he can see what's there. So in this image, you know that diver is headed to towards the lower right portion of that image. And those leading lines are more implied than specific, although I guess that the first two that I pointed out are more or less specific, but some of it are more implied as well. Okay, couple more images, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. That image, by the way, is entitled "What's in There?" and I took that at Rawlings, Virginia. This image is entitled "Red Line" and was shot at the Metro Center on the Red Line in Washington, D.C. And here you basically have leading lines which are created by the geometry of the ceiling of the metro stop. They literally drive you down the tracks to the vanishing point, which is at the lower left third intersection of the image. The train tracks also go from the middle lower portion of the image to that same point and converge there. The other thing you have is a line of people who are all waiting for the train all the way along that point to that vanishing point, if you will. So another example of using a structure as a series of leading lines. Okay, this image, one of my favorite fall images. I am more of a black and white shooter, and I love minimalism. But every once in a while, you got to shoot color, and every once in a while, you got to shoot something that's not really very minimal. And I found this image in upstate New York. I was driving home from a stop in Canada, or from a visit to Canada, where I was diving in the St. Lawrence River, and just happened to say, you know what, I'm going to get off the highway and I'm going to take a drive and just see what I see, because it's fall, the colors are beautiful, and I found this little country road with these trees along the way. That leading line is literally, in this case, the road. It is also the angle of the tree, both of which just, the road ascends, the tree line, the top of the tree line descends to that vanishing point, which is the end of the road there. But it draws you into the image, wondering what beautiful colors are down the road and what will I see next. So that's another example of leading lines. Okay, a couple more, and then we'll go on to questions, etc. This one is called "The Way Up." And this is a small room in a gun battery in Bermuda. And what intrigued me about this was I looked in the doorway of this room, and that's all you see. You see this empty limestone building, which was basically a rectangular shaped building with a concrete floor, wooden roof, and this stairway that just goes up from the back corner. And for me, the issue here, or the question here, was what's at the top of the stairway? I don't know what's there. I can only imagine. The nice thing about this is there are 3 leading lines that draw you up to the top of the stairway. The 2 are the first that start at the lower left and lower right corners. They're the actual edge of the floor, which drive you diagonally to the bottom of the stairs. And then the third leading line is the stairway, which leads you up beyond the ceiling to wonder what's above. So another nice minimalist image with a nice set of leading lines. And then the last one, since it snowed the other day and it's almost all gone now, I thought I would show this one to you. This is called Winter Path. And this is clearly an example of a leading line. This was shot not this year, but a couple years ago, right as the snow was starting to melt, which left that path visible. And what's nice about that is it leads you right along the edge of the water and into the woods and beyond. Classic leading line. You could almost argue that there's almost a curve that goes back when you follow that path. You hit that tree on the left side, the branches to the tree are then starting to bend upward and into the right, and they bend you in to focus more in on the woods that are beyond the lake there. Another example in my mind of a good use of leading lines. In any event, that's the last image that I have for you. I'm going to do one quick thing, and then I'll open it up for questions. Improve your images. Okay, I've shown you a number of examples, probably about 20 or so, 25 examples of the use of leading lines in my photography. And what I encourage you to do is take your cameras out. Even if you don't have your cameras, look at things out there and see things. If you have your camera, take pictures of them. Don't just snap a picture because it looks like the same picture that everybody's going to put up on Facebook. Look for an image and try to construct or compose an image that has a leading line in it. It's going to create more of a storyline. Do that by changing your shooting position, whether that means tilting the camera up, tilting it down, moving it to the left or moving it to the right to frame your image a little bit differently, whether that means stooping down and getting lower to the ground to shoot an image, or getting up above your subject like the piano that I shot and shooting more out and looking down onto that piano. Look for different angles where there are structures and trees and waterways and paths and lines and edges that will draw you from the beginning of your image deeper into your subject. Experiment with cropping once you get to post-production. Well, actually, not just post-production. Experiment with cropping in terms of your camera and focusing in and cropping the image the way you want. So in other words, compose your image. Don't just shoot an image, compose it. Once you get back home and you're on your laptop and you're in post-processing and you're editing your image, you can also look at cropping the image to create a stronger sense of the use of leading lines. Lastly, I'd say once you're able to find those leading lines and create those compositions, think about how when you're in post-processing, how shading, in other words, increasing the shadows and removing input that drives you towards your subject with vignettes, with gradients, etc. Think about highlighting images by creating a radial gradient around it. Increase the exposure slightly so that your eye is drawn to the lighter portion of the image. Think about vignetting to darken up the edges to draw your attention. Now, with vignetting, I would say don't automatically just use the vignetting function, say in Photoshop or Lightroom, because that's going to create an even vignette that doesn't necessarily fit your image. Create a gradient, a radial gradient to put that highlight, that vignette around the subject so that you're led into that or drawn into it, almost like a funnel. So get out there and shoot and see what you can find. Okay, so with that, I want to thank you for your attention. My email address is here, frank@fssphotography.com. So if you have any questions beyond this presentation, go ahead and send me an email. I'm more than happy to respond. I love to teach. and I'd be more than happy to help you beyond what I've said in this presentation if you have any questions. And at this point, Lorraine, I'm going to let you have the floor and open it up for questions for me. I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Much, Frank. Yeah, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box and I can relay them to Frank. If you'd like to ask him directly, just raise your hand. You'll see that little symbol on the top of the chat box. You can just click on that and raise your hand, and I can unmute your microphone so you can ask the question directly, whatever you prefer. Thanks so much, Frank. I think that gives us a much more sophisticated way of composing a picture, but also looking at a photography or a painting exhibit. So thank you.
Great.
I know when you were talking, I was scrolling through my photos on my iPhone, trying to find those leading lines, and it gives you a whole another way to look at it and think about the picture you're composing.
Absolutely.
The first question is, most of
Okay.
your post-processing done in Lightroom or PS or both?
I use both. Generally speaking, I use Lightroom. Because that's basic. That I think most photographers will consider that sort of the minimalist editing that you do. Photoshop, generally speaking, is reserved for when you want to really alter an image. So, in other words, if you've got an image and all of a sudden you realize, oh, I stuck my thumb in the middle of the camera when it took the image. Somehow I've got to get that thumb out of there. Or more realistically, you've got a great image and you're looking at it and you say, well, I don't like that fire hydrant right in the middle of my snow scene. You use Photoshop to edit that fire hydrant out. You do things like that, but just try to keep it minimal. You try to shoot, as a landscape photographer, you try to shoot what you see with minimal changes. But every once in a while, you get artistic, and those are usually reserved for Photoshop. Lightroom doesn't really do much of that. So.
Okay. Do you have recommendations for a beginner camera? I usually use my iPhone.
It's interesting you say that because I have a young friend who's a photographer, and he literally started with his iPhone. He's 13 years old now. He's been shooting for about 2 years. And when I was up in Canada last, we actually spent a couple of days going around Kingston. He had an iPhone for years, and that's what he shot with. And he asked me about that. In fact, he was the young man who asked about the mobile photography course that I taught online about a year and a half ago. In any event, yeah, he graduated up to a Sony, a moderately priced Sony with a cropped sensor. Basically, go by price. I mean, you can go from a couple of $100 all the way up to I hate to say it, but $50,000 if you really want the most ridiculous cameras on the planet. Just pick something that's within your budget. Almost every camera that you're going to buy today is going to be at least as capable as Ansel Adams had when he was shooting his landscapes.
Wow.
100 years ago, almost 100 years ago at this point.
Yeah.
So you really can't go wrong. I would say if you're really serious about your photography, look at an interchangeable camera body so that you could use multiple lenses depending upon what you like to shoot. And in landscape photography, you usually have a wide angle lens, a medium range lens, and then a telephoto zoom lens, which you can use in various scenarios. So it's usually sort of the three, classic landscape kit lenses. If you do portraits, you're usually using 85 millimeter and 50 millimeter lenses. Use them all, have them all. But you can pick what's within your budget and works. And then realize that, as you get more interested, you're going to start pulling more and more money out of your pocket to buy better and better cameras. But don't get yourself into that trap too soon. You don't want your wife any.
Your black and white shots are beautiful. How do you get such deep, dark blacks?
The first thing is thank you. When I look at a scene, my mind starts thinking about it in black and white and contrast more than color. Although I do have plenty of color images that just scream, shoot me in color. I basically do the classic Lightroom editing where I darken the blacks and the shadows and to some degree raise the whites and the highlights. You got to be real careful about doing that because if you overdo it, it looks unnatural and artificial. But basically, that's really it. There are a number of presets in Lightroom that will allow you to transfer or transition your image from color to black and white. And then there are a bunch of presets which give you different black and white looks. And you can get a sense for what those are if you use those presets. I will use them once in a blue moon, but basically I desaturate everything and then start playing with contrast myself. And I've come up, well, I think I mentioned it once in a course a while back. I've come up with a histogram pattern that is very atypical for most photographers, and that is everything at the brightest end of the histogram. The white end is really low and almost minimal, and then it rises up as a peak at the back end, the dark end of the histogram. And I just kind of play around, and that's where I end up. So literally trial and error experimentation with Lightroom.
Okay, great.
No
Next question.
big secrets there. I will. Oh, there's one other thing. I will say this: if you do Google Ansel Adams, Ansel Adams came up with a description of black and white tones within a black, because he shot black and white within an image, and he called it the zone system, going from the deepest, darkest blacks all the way up to the brightest whites and all of the gradations in between. And you do a little bit of reading of that, and you'll get a sense for how he created that system and what it means. And it gives you a better appreciation when you're looking at an image for what really needs to be brighter and darker. But I can't tell you that I apply that. It's just I've learned it, I've absorbed it, and try to use it the way I like it. Sorry, long answer.
No, that's okay. Did I miss it? Did you mention to everyone that there is an Ansel Adams photography exhibit right now?
Unfortunately,
Is
that
it still
exhibit
going on?
closed on the 2nd of January. So
Oh,
yeah,
darn. Oh,
yeah,
darn.
I waited and waited. My wife bugged me, and we finally made it on the last
Yeah.
day.
Uh,
But or right before the last day. But yeah, it's over. It's probably going to be somewhere else in a museum close by. You might want to look for it.
yeah.
It's about, I think, 69 of his more famous, obviously landscapes out west for the most part. Phenomenal stuff.
Oh, yeah.
But what you don't realize is that he's also got, he does a lot of close up, if you want to call it landscape, macro landscape shots of flowers and petal, water, lily petals, that kind of thing, that you don't really think of with Ansel Adams, because we all think, oh, giant mountainscapes. But he did a lot more, and there were some of those in there too. So it's kind of interesting. Really good exhibit.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, it's over now.
The next question I think we both can answer, Frank.
Mhm.
You mentioned an online class you taught. Do you have others you will be offering in the first half of 2022? I can tell you some of Frank's previous classes are on the Loudoun County Public Library YouTube page. So those were recorded and they're there. And this one will be there as well, probably by early next week. And I'm always trying to get Frank to do more photography programs for us, but he's a pretty busy guy. Do you want to talk about some things that you have going on in the future?
Yeah, I have two. I am, I guess, definitely an adventurer in the sense that I've got to go places and shoot, and I have two plans at this point. The first plan is sometime in the month of February, I'm looking at going up to Canada to shoot snowscapes, this time in Algonquian Provincial Park up in Ontario. So I think Lorraine and I were talking maybe in March, I'll have some photos and stories to tell about how I froze to death up there. So that might be March. There is also probably immediately after that a trip to Florida to do cave diving. where I have some ideas for some photography I want to shoot underwater in the caves, which could turn into something later on. We'll see. Depends on whether or not I flood my camera or not.
Mhm.
Got to avert the disasters. And then another idea that has come up, which is probably a little bit farther down the road, is trying to do a trip up north of the Arctic Circle into the Inuit tribal areas to do photography up there. We're starting communications with some of those tribal leaders to get permission to go up there, probably a year and a half from now. So that's a long way off, but yeah, there's always an adventure in the planning. That and
Frank does a good
heading to West
job
Virginia.
taking out of those adventures just some really, practical information also about photography and how to photograph in different lights and conditions. So I'm sure something will come out of those trips.
Oh yeah. Oh, definitely. I'm going to boast one more time. I just won a couple of awards at the New York Photography Awards. Um, about 3 weeks ago, I was notified, and it was one photograph that won an award in two categories, and had nothing to do with any of my outdoor adventures. It was a big panorama that I shot of New York City. And oh, by the way, it was in color, not black and white. Uh, People tend to like color, not my black and white. But anyway, the bottom line is, so I am always out there shooting things. I always come. I live in Reston, but I always come out to Loudoun County looking for something to shoot too, because I'm trying to get away from all of the masses of people here and shoot nice landscape scenes. So I'm sure I'll have some more of those as the weather gets a little nicer too.
So
Any other
Frank,
questions at this point?
yeah, one more. Someone's saying Lorraine's background is an example of lines and light. How would you shoot this?
How would I shoot it?
Yeah, there are a lot of lines behind me, aren't there?
There are a lot of lines. Okay, and I never really thought about
They're
that.
not really leading anywhere, are they? They're just kind of, you would have to,
I would, if I'm looking at Lorraine right now in her image, the first thing I would think about doing is moving as everybody's looking at the image, moving you to the left
Mhm,
in front of the light, the
mhm,
lamp.
mhm,
My left, you're right,
mhm.
even farther, and I would silhouette you. No, that way,
Oh,
the other
that
way, the
one.
other way. Yeah,
Okay.
silhouette you in front of your lamp, because
Oh, okay.
there's light emanating from behind you. You've got plenty of light on you. And there's a diagonal line of that light comes straight down to you from there.
Got it.
Uh,
So you would use the light.
yeah, yeah, but there are probably a million different answers if I was actually in the room looking at you.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what I was talking about earlier. Go out and experiment with it. You never know what you're going to find.
Hmm.
There are leading lines everywhere.
Yeah.
Edges of, in this case, the edge of your drapes across the top of the window, the
Right.
edge of the ceiling, the line that comes down or from the light and up with the shadow
The light. Yeah.
is a line.
Hmm.
Uh, all kinds of things are lines,
Hmm.
and all they do is draw you in and draw you to your subject. So yeah,
Yeah.
plenty to
Yeah.
do.
Gives us a lot
Can
to
never
look
go
at
wrong with
when we're outside and out
it.
and about, right? Any other
Hmm.
questions? I want to thank you all for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be
Thank
together.
you.
It's a cold, snow evening. Thank you again, Frank. It was a pleasure.
You're
And
welcome.
we
Thank
hope
you.
to have Frank back soon. Just keep checking the Loudoun County Public Library events page and our Facebook page, and we'll let you know when another one's coming up. Bye-bye, everyone.